Hey everybody, I wanted to record a short tutorial video about cutting temporary tattoos on your silhouette cameo. Um, when I was doing a search on YouTube and some different blogs about how to do this, it seems like the tutorials were either out of date or not particularly helpful. So I've been messing around with it and I thought I'd share a little bit about what I learned. So I guess first thing I'll show you is the actual paper that I'll be cutting on. So Silhouette makes their own temporary tattoo paper. However, it's really expensive. It works out to about $5 a sheet. I think I've seen it on sale on Amazon for something like $3 a sheet. This stuff that I found, I was maybe a little skeptical of, but I took a chance and bought it, and it ended up working great. And it's you can get 10 sheets here for about $2 a sheet. And the other thing about the silhouette paper is you only get 2 sheets per package. And so depending on what you're making these for, that's not a whole lot of material. So I'm thinking birthday parties or something like that, you would probably need several of those. So the only thing I would say to look out for is this particular company makes a different paper for laser printer versus inkjet printer. So just make sure that you choose the right product based on the type of printer that you have. The next thing you need is the art that you're going to be using for your tattoo. So the school that I work at is going to be hosting a 1970s themed all-school art show. So I thought it'd be fun to find some cool vintage 70s artifacts and make some little tattoos out of those. So all I did was I did a Google image search for some kitschy things. Found this lunchbox that's pretty cool, $6 Million Man. That's what I'm going to use for my particular tattoo. All right, so let's go back into Silhouette. And first thing that you need to do is go into page setup mode. All right, so I'm going to click that up here in the top right corner. And in page setup, remember we bought the paper that's 8.5 by 11 or letter size paper. So down here in media size, I need to make sure that that matches. You can buy it in A4 size as well. So obviously, if you did that, you'd want to choose A4. But this will ensure that when I lay out my actual images, it's going to print them correctly. Second thing we need to do is click on the registration mark tab. And we want to turn registration marks on. All right, so if you haven't worked with registration marks before, what they basically do is make sure that your cutter aligns exactly to the material that you're putting into the machine. So in other words, if I print some images on a piece of paper with these registration marks, Silhouette will now know exactly where to go to cut the outline around those images. And I'll show you how to do that right now. So with those registration marks on, next thing I need to do is load in my image. So I'm going to grab that, drag it in. It's obviously a little too big for a tattoo depending on what you're into. So I'm going to shrink that to something like 2 by 2 inches. Sounds about right. Okay. Okay. So I technically could make copies of several of this particular image and go ahead and print it. I like to go ahead and do the tracing function first. It's just easier to do on one than on several. So I'm going to click on the Trace tab. I'm going to select Trace Area, highlight my image. Okay, we're going to do Solid Fill. Now threshold, typically I have found that you can go just about all the way to 100% threshold. In this case, I've got a little bit of a gray background, so I need to dial that down a little bit until I'm just getting the outline of that lunchbox, okay? The other thing that you can do to kind of help, you'll see it's pretty pixelated. And I'm not worried about any of the stuff inside because we're only trying to trace the outline. Because remember, what we're trying to do is print this image on a regular printer and then cut it out in the end. So I'm not worried about any of the detail inside right now. If I move scale up, what that essentially does is smooth those outside lines. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, it doesn't look very smooth. It's still pretty pixelated. I promise you, it's going to work out just fine because the way that this temporary tattoo paper works is it is a clear, transparent kind of adhesive type decal. And so you're never going to notice those little jagged edges because it's going to be cutting out of a transparent material. So I am noticing though that the top right of my lunchbox isn't quite capturing. So I'm going to play with these settings a little bit until I make sure that I have a continuous line around the outside of my art. Okay, that actually looks pretty good, believe it or not. I'm going to choose Trace Outside Edge. And now you'll see that the result actually looks a lot better than what that trace might have led you to believe. You can see this continuous red line around the outside. That's where it's going to cut, which is beautiful because I'm going to leave behind this gray background, which I didn't want as part of my tattoo anyway. I wanted just the lunchbox part. All right, so I'm feeling pretty good about that. I'm going to zoom out, and then I'm going to copy this. I'm going to start to make multiples. Whoops. Just going to try to arrange these really quickly. Again, because this particular media is pretty expensive, I really want to maximize. I'm going to scale this down a little bit so I can get 3 across. I really want to maximize my material, so I might err on the side of a little bit smaller images to make sure that I can get more out of it. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is where those registration marks are, those cross-hatched kind of areas. You want to make sure your image does not overlap with those. If they do, it will maybe print on your printer. However, it's very likely that Silhouette will not cut them out correctly. So you need to stay inside of those crosshatch little areas. So down here at the bottom, for instance, I've got this one image. Oh, I might be able to fit. This one image overlaps, so I'm going to have to delete that one. So as it turns out, I'll only get 11 out of this particular sheet without playing a little more. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Top left corner, I'm going to click print, send to my printer, and I'm going to print on my color laser printer. Okay. Here's one thing to keep in mind with this particular type of media is when you pull it out of the package, you'll notice that there are 2 pieces. There's a translucent kind of glue layer, and then there's a piece of paper that is kind of the weight of cardstock. That cardstock is what you're going to print on, and you'll also notice that the cardstock has kind of a shinier side and a more matte, unfinished side. You want the ink to go on the shiny side, okay? So I would recommend testing on a regular old piece of paper in your particular printer just to verify that you know what side of the paper the ink actually goes on before you start feeding in the more expensive material. I would also recommend doing this one sheet at a time. Again, just because I'm a little conscious of money and material, I don't want to feed 5, 6, 7 sheets into my printer and risk one of them getting kind of jammed. So I feed them in one at a time. Once you have your sheet back out from your printer, you'll go ahead and apply that adhesive layer on top of your print. Okay, make sure you use a little squeegee to iron out any air bubbles in there. And then you'll mount that to your cut mat. So you'll notice that in my setup in Silhouette Studio, I've got the cut mat on here. I'll line it up just the way you see it on your screen. Now we're ready to cut. So I'm going to go to the Send or the Cut tab. For my material, I'm going to choose, there is a setting for temporary tattoo paper, the printable kind. You'll notice that that changes the blade depth to 4, okay? The other option that I have found through some trial and error is I'll always choose this overcut option. This particular image doesn't have any hard corners, so it's probably not going to make a difference at all. But if you have something that's more square or a rectangular shape, I found that you want to make sure that you get this thing cut completely out. So I do that overcut feature. The other thing that I have found, maybe it's just my machine, but after several tests, this thing needed 2 passes. And I think that's because you're really cutting through 2 layers of material. So remember, you have that kind of cardstock layer, and then you have that clear adhesive decal layer on top. And even though there are default settings for this in Silhouette Studio, I found that 2 passes worked much better. So I'd rather wait the few extra minutes for that instead of having a mess up. From there, that's it. You're ready to cut.